Hill. We're going to hear from our very own Tom Fitzgerald of Fox 5, Washington, D.C. Tom, you were there all day yesterday. Had to have been quite the experience for a seasoned journalist like yourself. Can you explain from beginning to end what your day looked like?
Yeah, well, Daytona, good to talk to you. I will tell you, we were where we are right now in the rotunda here at the Capitol, waiting for what we knew was not going to be a regular count of the electoral vote. We knew that going in, but clearly nobody was predicting the day that we had. At about 1 o'clock, the House and the Senate began their joint session to begin counting these votes. And then that only lasted for about 15 minutes. The first objection came in for Arizona, and then both houses adjourned to begin their debate. It was about a half hour after that point that right behind me in the center of this rotunda that we were in right now, a U.S. Capitol police officer came to that spot and started shouting to everybody, "Evacuate the building, evacuate the building." Now, a lot of us are familiar with people sometimes coming into this space. It is a public space and shouting things. So a lot of us leaned over to see who it was. Once we realized immediately that it was a Capitol police officer, this was not a joke, this was not a drill, we evacuated. All of the equipment up here in the media area was broken down. And then we were on the move. We were brought through some of the subterranean network of tunnels which connect all of the House, Senate, office buildings with the United States Capitol itself. We were held in one area for about 45 minutes to an hour. We were then moved again. And then while we were in our secondary holding location under lockdown, we were told to get up against the walls. The reason we were told to get up against the walls was because they were going to be bringing in U.S. Capitol police officers who had been badly injured in the melee that went on out in the U.S. Capitol. We saw facial lacerations. We saw wounds to people's heads. We saw wounds to people's necks. There was blood on some of their faces. They were all upright. They were all talking to each other. But we could tell that they had been in a very, very serious situation. At that point, as soon as those officers got through, another U.S. Capitol Police officer came up to us and told us that we had to go into a locked room immediately and barricade that room. And that is what we did. And that is where we were for the next 5 hours as we waited out until the all clear was given.
Tom, I'm currently showing some images from inside Capitol Hill where podiums are destroyed. Everything looks extremely disheveled. I'm interested as to what the environment is like today. You're inside the rotunda. Can you give us a little sense of not only what it looks like in there, but what it feels like?
Well, what I will tell you is the difference between yesterday and today is night and day. We are essentially in an armed camp right now. There has been a 9-foot wall, a steel perimeter, that has been put up this morning around the entire complex of the United States Capitol. So what we are dealing with right now are local police, U.S. federal police, the FBI. We are also seeing elements of the National Guard here, and the surrounding states have also sent law enforcement components. You're talking about Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York have all sent law enforcement officials here. So there is literally a small army now guarding this Capitol in this complex. We are told, Daytona, that steel fence, and if you saw the one that went up around the White House over the summer during those protests, it is exactly the same fence. This is going to be in place for at least the next 30 days and certainly through the inauguration of the President-elect Joe Biden.
Yeah, and you know, the work is far from over. We played out briefings from Pelosi and from Schumer earlier today. I have to ask you, what are you hearing on your end about the 25th Amendment and the possible impeachment of the president? How possible is this, and could we be hearing some results today?
Well, Nancy Pelosi couldn't have been any more clear about this. She said that if the Vice President Mike Pence does not invoke the 25th Amendment. And remember, what that is the vice president and a majority of the cabinet would have to vote to notify Congress that the president of the United States is no longer able to execute the powers of his office. And then the Congress would then decide whether or not to accept or reject that. If he does not do that, then Nancy Pelosi says the House will move in swift order to pass articles of impeachment. Now, is there enough time between now and, January 20th to do that? Well, they certainly could pass the articles of impeachment, but remember, this is a two-step process. We all learned this lesson back in February, even though that seems like it was 6 months ago, or 6 years ago now. It's unclear whether or not they would actually be able to complete that, but it is very likely when Nancy Pelosi says something like this, Nancy Pelosi often does it.
Well, we'll, of course, be keeping our eye on any of those developing details. A last question for you, Tom. How profound of an event is this for American democracy? There's been so much breaking news that I feel like no one's really been able to take a step back and digest what has actually happened over the past 24 hours. For you, being a journalist covering this, you were alongside all of these lawmakers and have been covering them. What was it like going through an event like this and kind of seeing a personal side of them?
Well, what I'll tell you is, in some ways, January is now the 13th month of 2020 because it seems seamless in a way with the news cycles that we have been on, over the past year into this year now. As far as what this means from a historical standpoint, look, by no small measure, you have to go back to the War of 1812, when British troops stormed the U.S. Capitol, went up to the rostrum of the House of Representatives, and then set that building on fire. There have been security breaches over the years at the United States Capitol. In the 1950s, domestic terrorists from Puerto Rico shot up the floor of the House of Representatives after launching an attack on then President Harry Truman at the Blair House across the street from the White House. In the 1990s, we had 2 U.S. Capitol police officers shot and killed at a doorway entrance, leading to the construction of a massive Capitol Visitor Center. So it's not like there have not been security breaches here before. However, this was unprecedented. This was American citizens launching what they themselves called an insurrection on the United States Capitol. So you can take all the historical analogies, all the historical references that you want. Short of the War of 1812, I can't think of anything in the more than 200-year history of this building which amounts to what we saw here yesterday. It's that big.
Well, if it wasn't for journalists like you who went through it and were capturing what was going on, we would have no idea. Thank goodness for cameras and journalists out there doing great work. So we appreciate you, Tom. Any last thoughts on what's going on or to be looking forward to in the coming week and weekend?
Yeah, well, what I'll tell you is that the move today, though, is looking at the police response on this. Already with the Speaker Nancy Pelosi calling for the resignation of the U.S. Capitol Police Chief today. We know that the House Sergeant at Arms, who is in charge of overall security for the House, he has resigned. And Chuck Schumer came out in short measure after that. Remember, he's the minority leader right now, but not for long. When those Georgia senators sit down, he is going to be majority leader. He says he is going to fire the Senate Sergeant at Arms as soon as he takes over. So expect massive upheaval as far as the security officials up here, and also a whole lot of investigations and hearings looking into the central question of how did this happen.
I'm sorry, Tom, just one last question for you because you made me think of this. Has there been a switch in kind of a sense of unity for Congress? because that has been everyone's frustration as we awaited, obviously, the stimulus bill. That was a huge, huge story. And it seemed to be so much division between Democrats and Republicans. Last night, in those late hours, it seemed like there was somewhat of a sense of unity for some Democrats and Republicans coming together and being able to move forward on a decision that was unbelievable, honestly.
Well, I mean, there's two ways to look at that. You know, there's an old saying that politics makes strange bedfellows. I can tell you lockdowns make strange bedfellows. Well, yeah, sure. You know, in the initial hours after this, there were more calls for unity. There were more calls for working together. Several of the Republican senators who said that they were going to object to the electoral vote changed their minds. And there were not more objections. In fact, we were expecting half a dozen.